Something shifted. Maybe you felt it happen, or maybe you only recognized it in retrospect, standing in the middle of an ordinary moment and realizing that the familiar weight was gone. The constant low-grade monitoring, the relentless internal weather report about where things stood and what the last interaction meant, and whether you were too much or not enough, or some precise calibration between the two that kept moving every time you thought you had found it. Gone. Not because you decided to feel differently, not because you applied a framework or executed a strategy, or woke up one morning and chose a new emotional orientation. Because something in you completed a process, quietly, on its own timeline, without asking for permission or announcing its arrival. The internal reorganization that shifts a person from someone who is arranged around another person's capacity into someone who is arranged around their own. And the avoidant, who was entirely prepared for every version of you except this one, feels it before they understand it, before they have language for what changed. In the specific way the avoidant system registers things, below conscious articulation, in the body, in the altered frequency of the space between you, they feel that something is different. And the thing that is different is not a technique. It is you, entirely, irreversibly, without performance or agenda, you. Before the qualities of this new version, before the picture of who this is and what they carry and how they move through the world differently than who came before. The mechanism, the specific psychological reason why this version of you, this particular configuration of having genuinely returned to yourself, activates the avoidance pursuit rather than their withdrawal. The avoidance system was calibrated over the entire history of the relationship against a specific input, your previous self, the one that reached, that monitored, that hoped visibly, that organized its emotional state around the temperature of the dynamic. That version of you, however loving, however genuine, however entirely warranted in its desire for reciprocity, provided the avoidance system with exactly the conditions under which it operates most comfortably. Someone to manage, someone whose investment in the relationship created the pressure that justified the distance. Someone whose emotional availability was constant enough to be treated as a guaranteed feature of the landscape, rather than a chosen offering that could be withdrawn. The system never prepared for the offering being withdrawn, not in this form, not in this quality, because withdrawals it had encountered before came in one of two varieties: the angry withdrawal, which was pressure wearing a different costume, and the hurt withdrawal, which was need wearing absence as its expression. Both of those the system could manage. Both of those kept you, in some essential way, still organised around the relationship, still readable as someone whose primary occupation was this dynamic. This version is neither of those. This version is something the system has no file for. This version has simply left the orbit. Not dramatically, not as a statement, just actually, genuinely, in the lived reality of daily existence, departed the orbit that had been arranged around the avoidant and settled, with a naturalness that is completely unperformed, into an orbit arranged around yourself. The system cannot manage something it cannot locate, and you have become, in the most literal psychological sense, unlocatable by the usual methods. The first quality of this version of you: you stopped needing the story to resolve. The previous version of you, and this is not a criticism, it is a recognition of what the dynamic was doing to you, was living inside an open narrative, one with an unfinished ending that required resolution before forward momentum felt fully possible. The relationship, whatever its current state, had the quality of a suspended sentence, something that had not yet been completed and whose incompletion occupied a specific, significant portion of your interior bandwidth. This version of you has done something quiet and radical. You stopped waiting for the resolution and started living in the continuation. Not because you achieved closure, Closure is rarely given cleanly in avoidant dynamics, and waiting for it is one of the mechanisms by which people remain emotionally stationary for far longer than serves them. But because something in you made a different calculation. The unfinished quality of the story is real, and the continuation of your life does not require the story to finish. Both things are true. And you began living from the second truth rather than waiting in the first. This quality, the quality of someone whose life has resumed full speed, regardless of the unresolved, communicates something to the avoidance system that nothing else communicates with equivalent force. You are no longer available to be the relationship's emotional anchor, and a person who is no longer available as an anchor is, to a system that was using the anchor without acknowledging that it was using it, suddenly and urgently relevant in a way they were not before. The second quality is in the texture of your self-regard. Something changed in how you relate to yourself. The version of you that was inside the avoidant dynamic, even the strong, capable, genuinely self-aware version, had a specific vulnerability running beneath the surface. The question, never fully resolved, of whether the avoidance difficulty receiving you was information about your worth, whether the distance was, at some level, a verdict. That question was never answered by the dynamic. It could not be. The dynamic was not structured to answer it. The avoidance behaviour, intermittent, ambiguous, warm in fragments and withdrawn in others, did not produce the consistent, legible signal that would have allowed the question to be put to rest. So it ran, quietly, underneath the daily experience, colouring the way you interpreted the small things, contributing to the monitoring, the calibrating, the constant unconscious project of trying to determine whether you were enough. This version of you is not running that question, not because someone answered it, because you answered it, from the inside. Through whatever combination of time and reflection and painful, honest reckoning, and the specific clarity that absence sometimes produces, you arrived at the answer independently, without requiring it to come from them, without needing the avoidance behaviour to change in order to settle the question of your own value. The self-regard that emerges from this is qualitatively different from confidence as a performed state. It has a settledness to it, a quality of not needing to be confirmed that is perceptible without being announced. The person who no longer needs the avoidant to confirm their worth no longer gives off the subtle frequency of someone seeking confirmation, and the absence of that frequency changes the entire atmospheric quality of interactions between you. The avoidance system, which was running the familiar management protocols calibrated against someone whose self-regard was partially contingent on the dynamic, suddenly finds those protocols misfiring. There is nothing to manage. The need the protocols were designed to deflect is not present in its previous form. And in the confusion of the misfiring, something else runs instead. Attention. Genuine, undefended, drawn toward attention. Third, your relationship with your own desire has changed. The previous version of you knew what it wanted, the relationship, the reciprocity, the full version of the connection that was perpetually offered in fragments, but the wanting had a quality of suppression to it. The desire was present and was simultaneously managed, kept from full expression, filtered through the assessment of what was safe to want, given the actual conditions of the dynamic, what it was reasonable to hope for, given the demonstrated capacity of the person you were hoping toward. Desire filtered through what seems reasonable given this person's limitations is not desire in its full form. It is desire with its own wings clipped, a wanting that has pre-accommodated its own disappointment, that has already written the caveat into itself. This version of you has stopped clipping the wings, not directed at the avoidant necessarily, at life, at what you actually want from your existence, unconstrained by the question of what this specific dynamic can deliver. Your desire for the kind of relationship you actually deserve, for the specific quality of reciprocity and presence and being fully met that you know is possible, because you felt the shape of the desire that preceded it, is present in you now in its full, unedited, unaccommodated form. And full desire, inhabiting a person without apology, without the preemptive management of its own disappointment, has a quality, an energy, a forward-facing, self-trusting, unapologetic aliveness that is perceptible to the people around them, particularly perceptible to an avoidance system that spent considerable effort managing the contained version and now finds itself in proximity to the uncontained version. The uncontained version is not demanding, not pursuing, not directing its full desire at the avoidant with the pressure that would trigger the withdrawal response. It is simply alive, in its own direction, following its own internal compass, wanting freely without needing the wanting to be immediately answered. That quality of alive, uncontained, self-directed desire is one of the most compelling things the avoidance system has ever encountered, because it does not ask for anything, and things that do not ask for anything cannot be managed by the system that was built to deflect asking. They can only be drawn toward. The fourth quality of this version is perhaps the most specific. You stopped being afraid of losing them, not because you no longer care, because you crossed a particular threshold, the one where the fear of loss is no longer the organizing principle of your behavior in the dynamic, where the decisions you make about the relationship are made from what you actually want and what you actually need, rather than from the management of the terror of their withdrawal. Fear of loss is the invisible architecture of anxious attachment. It is what makes the reaching compulsive rather than chosen, what makes the accommodation automatic rather than deliberate, what keeps the monitoring constant and the calibrating perpetual, and the genuine self-expression intermittent, filtered through the ongoing calculation of what might push them away. The avoidance system reads fear of loss immediately, not consciously, somatically, in the quality of someone's presence, in the texture of their communication, in the specific frequency that people give off when their emotional well-being is organised around whether another person stays. The system reads it and responds to it by increasing distance, because someone whose fear of your departure is palpable is someone who requires the management of expectations. And the management of expectations is exhausting and activating and produces the familiar push toward exit. The absence of that fear changes everything about how the avoidant experiences your presence. Someone who is not afraid of losing you is someone the system does not need to create distance from. Someone whose presence does not generate the particular pressure of needing to be managed. Someone who is, in the most relaxing possible sense, simply there, present and genuine and real, and not organised around the question of whether you are going to stay. The avoidant, encountering someone in whose presence the management protocols have nothing to do, does something it was not designed to do. It relaxes. And a relaxed avoidant is one that moves toward rather than away, that reaches rather than retreats, that chases in the specific and often surprising way the avoidance system chases, not dramatically, not with declarations, but in the small, consistent, unmistakable movements of a system that has finally encountered a direction it wants to move in, that does not trigger its own defense against moving. There is a change in how you hold the past. The version of you that was inside the dynamic held the history of it with a specific emotional posture. Tight. Involved. Returning to it frequently, revisiting the moments that stung, replaying the interactions that confused, carrying the weight of what happened in a way that kept it perpetually present. Not by choice, because unprocessed relational experience has that quality of returning, of demanding attention in the present moment because it did not receive adequate processing in the moment it occurred. This version of you has processed, not erased, not forgiven in the sense of pretending nothing happened, but metabolized, turned the experience into understanding rather than wound, extracted from the history what is genuinely instructive about the pattern, about your own part in the dynamic, about what you need that you now know more clearly for having experienced its absence, and released what is not instructive, the recycling of pain, the continued residence in the experience of being hurt by someone who was not fully capable of not hurting you. The past is still there, you know what happened, you carry the learning, but you are no longer living inside the history as though it is the present tense. And a person who is not living inside the history as present tense is a person who is fully, actually, in the present, available to what is here, rather than perpetually managing the residue of what was there. The avoidant, encountering this presence, this specific quality of someone who is actually inhabiting the current moment rather than the accumulated weight of all the previous moments, finds something they were not expecting: ease. The quality of interaction that does not carry the history like weather, that is light in a way the dynamic, in its activated state, could never be, that allows for genuine contact without the contact being coloured by everything that preceded it. Ease is the most underrated thing the avoidance system craves, and this version of you, in the specific way that processing rather than suppressing the past produces, is easy to be near. Something changes in the body. This is not metaphorical. The version of you that returns to yourself after a period of compression in a difficult dynamic carries that return in the physical form, in the way you occupy space, in how you move, in the specific quality of presence that belongs to someone who is not currently engaged in the work of managing themselves for another person's comfort. The previous version of you, the one calibrated around the avoidance capacity, had a certain quality of held in, a subtle physical caution, the body of someone who is perpetually slightly braced, monitoring the environment for the signals that require response, not dramatic, not visible in any individual moment, but present as a texture, as a sustained quality of not quite fully inhabiting the physical self. This version of you is in the body completely. The ease is physical, the groundedness is physical. The specific quality of someone who has returned to themselves after a period of being organised around someone else shows in the way they inhabit their own physical existence, in the way they take up space without apologising for it, in the way they are still rather than braced, in the quality of attention they offer, present, genuine, unhurried, not simultaneously monitoring the environment for signals requiring management. The avoidance system, which processes social and relational information at a speed and depth most people are not aware of, reads all of this before a word is exchanged. In the physical reality of being in proximity to someone who has returned to themselves. And what the system reads is not threat, not pressure, not the familiar input that activates the defense. It reads safe. And towards safe, even the most defended system, especially the most defended system, the one that has been waiting its entire life for evidence that safe exists, moves. The new version of you also has a different relationship with time. The version of you that was inside the dynamic lived in a particular temporal distortion. The past, the history of the relationship, the moments of connection and the moments of withdrawal, was constantly present. The future, the question of where things were going, whether they were going anywhere, whether the investment would eventually produce the reciprocity it was reaching for, was perpetually in view. And the present was, in a real sense, compressed between the weight of the history and the urgency of the future into something narrow. Something that was difficult to fully inhabit because inhabiting the present required not monitoring the past and future simultaneously. This version of you lives in the present, not as a spiritual practice or a deliberate mindfulness discipline, as the natural consequence of having released the history and stopped organising around the future, of having become sufficiently at home in who you are right now, in the life you are currently living, that the present tense is where you actually reside. This temporal presence, the quality of someone who is genuinely here, in this conversation, in this moment, not simultaneously somewhere in the archive of what happened or the projection of what might, is felt by the avoidant in every interaction. Because the avoidant spends considerable time in the past and the future also, in the history of relational hurt, in the anticipated future of relational threat, in the specific temporal dislocation of someone who is managing against experiences that are not currently happening in a moment that deserves to be inhabited. Your presence in the present tense is a quiet invitation, not stated, not pressured, simply modelled, by someone who has found their way to actual now. And actual now, with someone who has genuinely found it, is the most compelling place the avoidant system has ever been invited toward. Here is what the avoidant does when this version of you appears. They notice first, with the specific noticing that precedes understanding. Something different in the atmosphere, something changed in the frequency, something about the quality of your presence that the management protocols, running their usual calibration, find themselves unable to file in any existing category. Then they watch. The avoidant is observant in the specific way of someone who has spent a lifetime reading relational environments for threat. They watch with the same acuity, now directed not at threat assessment, but at the genuinely novel experience of encountering something the system has no existing category for. They look for the familiar signals, the monitoring, the reaching, the subtle organisation around their response, and find them absent. Look for the fear of loss and find it not present in its previous form. Look for the need and find, in its place, something that looks disturbingly like genuine self-sufficiency, not performed, not deployed as strategy, actually present. And then, not immediately, not without the system's resistance, not without the friction of something moving against its own established grain, they reach. Not dramatically. The avoidance chase does not look like other people's chase. It looks like a text sent when sending was not the system's preference. A question asked that opens rather than closes. A showing up that was not required and was chosen anyway. A quality of attention that is unmistakably different from the managed, rationed, carefully controlled presence that was the previous default. It looks like the system doing something it was not designed to do, moving toward, opening, choosing the risk of the approach over the safety of the familiar distance. Because this version of you, the one that stopped chasing, stopped monitoring, stopped managing yourself around their capacity, stopped being afraid of their withdrawal, stopped needing their confirmation, stopped living inside the unresolved story. This version gave the system something it has never had before, a direction that feels safe to move in. And towards safe, in the end, everything moves. Even the architecture that was built specifically to prevent the moving. Even the system that has spent its entire existence perfecting the distance. Even the avoidant. Especially the avoidant. Because nobody, not even the person most defended against it, can indefinitely resist the pull of a safe place to land. And this version of you, in the quiet, unperformed, completely genuine way of someone who has finally, fully, without remainder, returned to themselves, is exactly that.